Well, good morning, everyone, and I want to take a moment just to give you a little bit of update on Kate and I and our moving extravaganza, which I feel like it has been, especially this week. So I want you to know that we did get all of our things delivered into our house. Now, what to do with it? We've actually made a little bit of progress and are feeling like we're more and more at home. And so we thank you for your patience with us as we've done this, and especially with me in trying to juggle being a new pastor and moving into a new house. So we're getting there and feeling good about being here. I also didn't expect it this morning, but I want to thank and notice our friends Charlene and Liz, who are actually members at Suncoast in Venice, but have joined us this morning. And, I want to point out, if you don't recall, that they allowed Kate and I to live with them for a really long time before we got our house. And so there were 4 adults and 5 preachers who were inhabiting the same house in the middle of a kitchen renovation. And so I have to tell you, I'm humble that they're even here to speak with us. I'm so grateful for their friendship and their hospitality and their love throughout that time. So this morning we will continue, as I mentioned, in our series, Give and Take. And we have talked each week about something that we could give up so that we might take in something new or better or more expansive. Today, we'll be thinking about giving up privilege and taking in humility. So as we think about that, and as we rest our hearts on it, please pray with me. Holy One, you give us so much. And one of the things that you give us each and every time we gather is your presence. And that is why we call this place holy ground. And so as we listen for you, I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts might rise up and meet you, and that you will be pleased. May it be so in your many names. Amen. So in today's gospel reading, we find Jesus encountering the tempter again. So we talked about the first temptation last week of turning the stone into bread. And so Jesus now finds himself in the wilderness after 40 days of fasting, only to encounter the tempter again. This particular temptation, I find at least, to be really hard. The tempter leads Jesus up to a mountain and in a flash, sort of miraculously, shows Jesus all the empires of the world and all the seats of power. And the tempter says to Jesus, look at all of this. It's been given to me, and I can give it to whomever I please. And the tempter says to Jesus, take one look at it, because I will give it to you if you will kneel down and worship me. Now I have to tell you, in the world we live in, this hits very close to home. This is not just some ancient biblical story anymore. Every day we hear stories, not just in this country, but worldwide, of the ways in which we are tempted to look and see power, the seats of power and authority, and we are offered them in a million different ways. Picture yourself, not Jesus, yourself in charge of all of these seats of power. Picture yourself with the authority over all of the places in the world where being an empire is valued. Imagine what it would be like to reap the benefits of being powerful and in power. You see, the tempter was trying to sell Jesus on 2 big things. I don't know about you, but it always makes me feel weird to say somebody's trying to sell Jesus on something. But it feels like that to me when I read this passage, that the tempter was trying to sell Jesus on two big things. First of all, the headiness of having lots of power. I mean, look at the nuances. It takes him up to a mountain where you are overlooking, looking over, power over, authority over all of this. And then he was trying to sell Jesus on the seduction of centering everything on yourself. May I say that again? The seduction of centering everything on yourself. So let's take a few minutes to talk about privilege, since it is what we are attempting today to give up. What the tempter was selling in a nutshell was privilege, offering Jesus the ultimate privilege. And the tempter is still selling it today. And by the way, this is not the tempter that is a red man with horns. This is the tempter that has many different faces and many different names. Amen? The thing is, it is often so woven into our culture that we don't even realize it or notice it. We don't realize how often we center on ourselves without an effort at all to center on another. And that is the very definition of privilege. May I say that again? It bears repeating. It is woven into our culture that we center on ourselves without any thought to centering on another. That is the definition of privilege. Now you've heard it. That thing we call white privilege. Right? You've heard that, right? It means that we center ourselves in the white experience or the Latino, and we stop and we fail to ever think about the black experience or the Latino experience or the Asian experience. And then we have to add all the other nuances to it. You know, things like how we center ourselves around gender, socioeconomic position, or class, or the list goes on and on. It is hard for us to take the lens of self off long enough to center ourselves on someone else or somewhere else. Perhaps an example would help us get our heads around it a little better. I want to give you two. One is an experience of my own, and I think a little more funny, and the second one a little more serious. The first one is, back in 2002, when I was elected to be an elder in this denomination, I was 45 years old, and I was one of 6 women who had been elected to the Board of Elders. As I began to do my work and travel around and visit churches, it never, ever failed that in some place in a church during my time with them, there would be a white man who would come up to me and say, "Why are we so gender imbalanced on the Board of Elders? There are all you women and just a couple of men. Why is that?" Now, you might imagine, it was a little hard for me to be nice. But it was certainly my role to try to be clear and teaching, but also nice. And it occurred to me in those moments that this is the very idea of privilege, to be centered on oneself and one's own view of the world, where in those white men's experience, there had always been more men than women in power and in authority. And so when they looked at 6 women and 2 men, it did not fit the place where they centered themselves. Make sense? It was so hard not to say, you know, for centuries, there have been only men in power. So give us a break and let us do it just for a minute. What I understand about it is that when you only center on yourself, which is true for any of us, by the way, not just white men, if you center yourself only on yourself, then it is almost impossible to imagine where someone else's center might be. A little more seriously, Kate and I have had the privilege of meeting a young man of Mexican descent, Victor, because he's been helping us with our house. He laid some new floors for us, and just a couple of days ago was in our home again and hanging up light fixtures and helping us with some other things. And as he finished up, he came in to tell us that he was finished, and so we began to talk to him, and he began to tell us his story. And his story was that he came to this country from Mexico when he was 16 years old. And he continued to tell us about the fact that he kind of went off on a path when he first got here because, he said, I took a lot of name calling from people about Mexicans. And I took in a lot of what opinions folks have, especially white people have, about Mexicans. And pretty soon, it sounded like from his story, he began to live into those perceptions of white people. He lived right into what we said we expected, which was for him to fail, which was for him to drink a lot, which was for him to, not work and not do the things that we think are important. He did that until one day he met Scott. And Scott, who was a little bit older white man, looked at Victor, and instead of centering himself on his own white privilege, he centered himself on Victor. And instead of seeing Victor through a white man's eyes, he saw Victor as Victor. And what he saw was someone who had a lot of potential. He saw someone who was worthy of his attention. He saw someone, not because he was in his white privilege thinking they were worthy, but because he saw Victor. And he thought Victor was worthy because of exactly who he was. They worked together for 12 years, and now, Scott has said to Victor a few years ago, he's time for you to go out and start your own business. And so today, Victor has his own business. He has a wife and 3 kids, and he is an amazing young man. Scott is one of those people who was able to center himself somewhere else besides in his own esteem. That's what it looks like to give up privilege. He didn't pay Victor under the table. He made Victor a real man. He made Victor a real person who was worthy and capable. You see, in the end, the idea of privilege, which we're trying to give up today, is the idea of where we center our attention. And where we center our attention is all about power and control. Because if I center my attention on my white privilege, then I have all the power and control. If I don't, I give that up. See, this is what the tempter was trying to sell Jesus. It's exactly what he's trying to say. He was saying, don't center on, he said, please, Jesus, center on yourself. Please do that. Because then you can have all this power. But watch this. Jesus did not center on himself. But he said, I will only worship God and I will only serve God. To me, that's one of those boom moments. There it was. A simple sentence. I will only worship God. I will only serve God. And before we try to make that too easy, because that's easy stuff to say, but let's look at that a little more closely. To only worship God means don't worship power or authority or money or fame or success. Worship God. Make it a regular practice to worship God. Why? So that we can be reminded of who we are in light of who God is. You see the difference in that centering? To remember who we are in light of who God And then only serve God. Don't serve power or authority or money or fame or success. Only serve God. When serving God, I want you to please hear this. When we serve God, there is only grace. Because there is only grace that comes from it. So if we're serving God, then it should only be grace that comes from us. Only worship God. Only serve. This is when we humble ourselves and when we are reminded of God's incredible grace toward us. Remember, we're trying to give up privilege and take in humility. Humility is no easier to take in than privilege is to give up. Humility is when we really get it that God has been gracious to us. That God centers God's self on us and grants us grace. What if we centered ourselves on the other and granted grace? Then we are humbled twice. We're humbled by God's grace to us, and we're humbled by what it looks like when we extend grace to another. It is the only antidote I know to the seduction of privilege. The most profound story I've ever heard about this happened in the years after apartheid in South Africa. Archbishop Desmond Tutu both founded, headed up, and oversaw the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa in the years that followed apartheid. This commission had one mission, and that was to try to find ways for all of the horrible things that had happened between African people to find some kind of reconciliation. One of the stories from the commission happened in a courtroom where the commission had gathered some of the folks who'd been part of the Afrikaans movement to overtake the townships and to treat some of the native African people with such disdain and violence. And the Court of Reconciliation was looking for a way that those things might be healed. On this particular day in the courtroom, Officer de Blick was one of the Afrikaans soldiers who had committed all kinds of atrocities. And one of the people for whom those atrocities had been a part was an old African woman. And the story went like this. Officer de Blick and his buddies came to her township. The first time they came, they found her 18-year-old son and shot him point blank in the head. And then they partied around the fire while they watched him burn. And then only a year later, they came back to the same township. Officer de Blick and his buddies, this time they took her husband. They threw gasoline all over him, lit him up, and taunted him while he burned. As he was dying in the fire, he looked up to his wife, this old black woman, and said, "Forgive them." And so on this day in the courtroom of reconciliation, the counsel said to the old black woman, "What do you want? What would make this better? Tell us." The old woman said, "I want three things. I want these officers to tell me where my husband's body is buried so that I can go and get him and give him a proper burial. Second, I want Officer de Blick to come to my township and my home once a month so that I can love on him and show him mercy. Because I've lost my family, but I still have love to give. And number 3, I would like to come and give Officer DeBlick a hug. The courtroom, as you might imagine, just like this room, was full of people. The old black woman got up out of her seat and made her way over to Officer DeBlick. She reached out and she took him in a big embrace. And they say that her grace and her embrace was so powerful that Officer DeBlick passed out on the floor. The sheer power of her grace caused him to lose consciousness. Think about that. That is centering on someone else with humility and grace. And in that moment, as he was spread out across the floor, someone in the back of the courtroom began to sing Amazing Grace.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that taught
This week, I hope that we'll remember to center ourselves on God and on the other. May we be intentional about shedding the chains of power that bind us and enslave us. May we be humbled by receiving grace so that we can give that grace away. May it be so.